Have you ever stopped to wonder who is truly in the driver's seat of your life? We like to imagine ourselves as rational, deliberate beings who weigh every option with the precision of a master chess player. We believe that our choices, from the career paths we follow to the small items we pick up at the grocery store, are the result of careful, conscious thought. But what if that sense of control is largely an illusion? What if the vast majority of our behavior is governed by a hidden machinery that operates entirely outside of our awareness, making split-second decisions before our conscious mind even has a chance to chime in? In the pages that follow, we are going to pull back the curtain on the human psyche to explore the fascinating tug-of-war between two distinct systems of thought. One is a lightning-fast, intuitive engine that thrives on patterns and gut feelings, while the other is a slow, methodical processor capable of complex logic but prone to extreme laziness. Understanding the relationship between these two minds is not just an academic exercise. It is the key to understanding why we make mistakes, why we succumb to biases, and how we can ultimately make better decisions. This journey will take us through the hidden hallways of cognitive psychology, revealing how our environment primes us to act in certain ways, why our memories are often unreliable narrators of our own lives, and why we struggle so profoundly with the language of statistics and risk. You will learn why your brain is designed to take shortcuts and how those shortcuts, while efficient, can lead you into predictable traps. By the end of this exploration, you will possess a new lens through which to view your own behavior and the behavior of everyone around you. You will discover that by acknowledging the limitations of our lazy minds, we can begin to cultivate a more disciplined, insightful, and intelligent way of navigating the world. Welcome to the study of how we think, how we choose, and how we can learn to truly see. To navigate the complexities of human behavior, we must first establish a framework for how the brain processes information. This book is built upon the foundational concept that our mental life is divided into two distinct agents, which we will refer to as System 1 and System 2. System 1 is the fast thinker. It is the automatic, impulsive, and often emotional side of our cognition that operates with little to no effort. It is what allows you to read a person's facial expression or complete the phrase bread and, without a moment's hesitation. System 2, by contrast, is the slow thinker. It is the seat of our conscious, reasoning self. When you have to fill out a tax form, park a car in a narrow space, or solve a difficult multiplication problem, System 2 is at work. It requires intense focus and consumes significant mental energy. Throughout this book, we will explore how these two systems interact. We will see that while System 2 believes it is the protagonist of our story, it is often merely a supporting actor, frequently endorsing the snap judgments and biases generated by the much more active System 1. We will delve into the themes of cognitive ease and strain, examining how the law of least effort dictates much of our mental activity. We will investigate the various heuristics, mental shortcuts, that our brains use to simplify a complex world, and we will uncover the systematic errors, or biases, that result from these shortcuts. From the way we perceive risk to the way we evaluate our own happiness, the interplay between these two systems shapes every facet of our existence. This orientation provides the map. The following chapters provide the terrain. To understand the fundamental mechanics of human thought, we must first confront a surprising truth. Our brains are remarkably lazy. This isn't a character flaw, but rather a biological imperative. The brain is an energy-hungry organ, and in the interest of survival, it has evolved to conserve that energy whenever possible. This leads us to the law of least effort, a principle stating that if there are several ways of achieving the same goal, people will eventually gravitate to the least demanding course of action. In the realm of cognition, this means we prefer to let our automatic System 1 handle things rather than engaging the high-effort, energy-draining System 2. To see this dynamic in action, consider a classic puzzle known as the bat and ball problem. It is a deceptively simple question that has been posed to thousands of university students, including those at elite institutions like Harvard and Princeton. The problem goes like this. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? For the vast majority of people, an answer leaps to mind almost instantly: 10 cents. This answer feels right. It is intuitive, quick, and satisfying. However, this answer is also wrong. If the ball cost 10 cents and the bat cost $1 more, $1.10, the total would be $1.20. Take a moment now to actually do the math. If the total is $1.10 and the difference is exactly $1, the ball must cost 5 cents and the bat must cost $1.05. What happened in your brain when you first read that problem? Your System 1, the impulsive and automatic processor, took control. It saw a familiar pattern, numbers that easily add up to $1.10, and it offered an intuitive answer without waiting for verification. Because the problem appeared simple, System 1 didn't feel the need to call upon System 2 for a rigorous check. It assumed it could handle the task on its own. The lazy System 2, happy to remain in a state of low effort, simply accepted the suggestion of System 1 and moved on. This error is not a sign of low intelligence in the traditional sense. Rather, it is a sign of a lack of cognitive monitoring. Many highly intelligent people fail this test because they are prone to accepting the first plausible-sounding answer that comes to mind. This exposes a critical vulnerability in our thinking, our innate mental laziness. System 2 is capable of solving the problem, but it requires a mobilization of effort that the brain is often reluctant to provide. We are, by nature, cognitive misers. The implications of this laziness are profound. Research has shown that people who are more resistant to the easy answer in problems like the bat and ball task tend to score higher on various measures of intelligence. This is because intelligence is not just about raw processing power. It is also about the ability to exert self-control and maintain focus, tasks that belong to System 2. When we allow System 1 to run on autopilot in situations that actually require deliberation, we are effectively limiting our own intelligence. We see this manifest in daily life when we jump to conclusions about a news headline without reading the article, or when we make a snap judgment about a person's character based on a single interaction. In each case, we are choosing the path of least resistance. We are letting our lazy mind take the wheel because engaging our critical thinking faculties feels like hard work. By understanding that our first impulse is often a product of an energy-saving shortcut, we can begin to train ourselves to pause, engage System 2, and avoid the common errors that mental laziness produces. The bat and ball problem is a reminder that the obvious answer is often a trap set by our own biology. Imagine you are looking at a word fragment. Soapy on its own, this string of letters is ambiguous. You could fill in the blank to make soup or soap. Now imagine that just moments before seeing this fragment, you were asked to think about the word eat. In this scenario, you are almost certain to complete the fragment as soup. If, however, you had been thinking about the word shower, you would almost certainly see soap. This phenomenon is known as priming, and it is one of the most powerful and unsettling ways in which our System 1 operates. Priming occurs when exposure to a specific stimulus, a word, an image, a sound, or even a physical sensation, unconsciously influences our response to a subsequent stimulus. It is as if a pebble is dropped into a pond. The ripples spread out and activate a whole network of related concepts in your mind. When you hear the word eat, your brain doesn't just process that one word. It silently activates a web of associations: food, hunger, kitchen, spoon, and of course soup. When you then encounter soapy, the soup interpretation is already warmed up and ready to be used. The truly incredible thing about priming is that it doesn't just affect our thoughts, it actually influences our physical behavior, and it does so without us having any conscious awareness of the process. A famous study conducted by psychologist John Bargh and his colleagues illustrated this perfectly. They asked a group of university students to assemble short sentences from a scrambled set of words. For one group of students, the words were associated with being elderly words like Florida, forgetful, bald, gray, or wrinkle. After the task was finished, the students were told they were done and were allowed to leave. What they didn't know was that the researchers were timing how long it took them to walk down the hallway. The results were staggering. The students who had been primed with words related to old age walked significantly slower than the control group. Their bodies had unconsciously adopted the physical characteristics of the concepts they had just been thinking about. This is known as the ideomotor effect, and it demonstrates that the line between thought and action is much thinner than we realize. Another profound example of priming can be found in the work of researcher Kathleen Vohs. She conducted a series of experiments to see how the concept of money affects human behavior. In her studies, participants were primed with the idea of money in various subtle ways, perhaps by seeing a stack of Monopoly money on a table, or by working on a computer that had a screensaver of dollar bills floating in water. Vohs found that people who were primed with money became more individualistic. They were more likely to persist in trying to solve a difficult problem on their own before asking for help, and they were also less likely to help someone else who appeared to be in need, such as a researcher who accidentally dropped a box of pencils. These money-primed individuals were also more likely to prefer sitting alone rather than with others. The implication of this research is significant. The very environment we live in, filled with advertisements and cultural cues about wealth and commerce, may be constantly priming us towards self-reliance and away from altruism. We believe we are making conscious choices to be independent or helpful, but our system one is being nudged by the hidden triggers around us. Priming shows us that we are not the autonomous, fully conscious actors we think we are. We are constantly being shaped by the social and cultural conditions in which we find ourselves. Our judgments, our choices, and even our physical movements are being influenced by a silent, automatic system that responds to the world long before our conscious mind is even aware that anything has happened. By recognizing the power of priming, we can become more aware of the ripples in our own mental ponds and perhaps begin to take more intentional control over the environments that shape us. Imagine you are at a crowded party and you are introduced to a man named Ben. Within 5 minutes of chatting, you find him to be incredibly easy to talk to. He is charming, laughs at your jokes, and seems genuinely interested in what you have to say. Later that evening, a friend approaches you and asks if you know anyone who might be a good fit to help organize a local charity drive. Immediately, you think of Ben. You recommend him enthusiastically, telling your friend that Ben is a great guy who would be perfect for the job. But stop and think for a moment. What do you actually know about Ben? You know he is personable and has good social skills. Do you know if he is organized? Do you know if he is honest? Do you know if he has any experience with charity work? The answer is no. You have taken a single positive trait, his approachability, and allowed it to color your entire perception of his character. This is a classic cognitive error known as exaggerated emotional coherence, or more commonly, the halo effect. The halo effect is a mental shortcut where our system one takes one piece of information and uses it to build a complete, consistent, and often overly positive or negative picture of a person. Because we liked Ben's personality, we placed a metaphorical halo over his head, assuming that all his other qualities must be equally radiant. Our minds crave a simple, coherent story. It is much easier for System 1 to believe that Ben is good than to hold the more complex and accurate thought. Ben is a good conversationalist, but I have no idea about his professional competence or moral character. This tendency to oversimplify is a major source of judgment errors. We do this not only with people but with brands, political candidates, and even abstract ideas. If we like the design of a product, we are more likely to assume it is high quality. If we like a politician's voice, we may be more inclined to trust their policies. In each case, System 1 is jumping to a conclusion based on insufficient data, and System 2 is too lazy to step in and demand more evidence. Closely related to the halo effect is confirmation bias. This is the tendency of our minds to seek out, interpret, and favor information that confirms our existing beliefs, while simultaneously ignoring or discounting information that contradicts them. System 1 is not a scientist. It is a believer. It wants to find evidence that the world is exactly as we already think it is. Consider an experiment where people are asked a simple question: is James friendly? When faced with this question and no other information about James, studies show that people are much more likely to conclude that James is, in fact, friendly. Why? Because the very act of asking the question primes the mind to search for instances of friendliness. System 1 automatically begins to construct a narrative where James is a nice guy. It confirms the suggestion because doing so creates a quick and easy mental picture. This bias is why it is so difficult to change someone's mind once they have formed an opinion. We don't look at the world objectively. We look at it through a lens that is already tinted by our previous judgments. We see the friendly things James does and ignore the times he is rude. We see the good things Ben does and ignore the red flags. Both the halo effect and confirmation bias happen entirely beneath the surface of our conscious awareness. They are the tools System 1 uses to keep our world feeling predictable and simple. However, the price of this simplicity is accuracy. By making snap judgments and then stubbornly sticking to them, we leave ourselves vulnerable to manipulation and error. To combat this, we must learn to recognize when we are placing a halo on someone and force our System 2 to ask the difficult questions. What evidence do I actually have? Am I only looking at the information that supports my current view? Only by disrupting the automatic coherence of System 1 can we hope to see the world as it truly is. In our fast-paced world, we are constantly bombarded with information and forced to make decisions on the fly. To prevent our brains from becoming overwhelmed, we rely on heuristics, simple, efficient rules of thumb that allow us to make quick judgments. For the most part, these shortcuts are incredibly useful. They help us navigate social interactions, avoid danger, and manage the mundane tasks of daily life without needing to conduct a full scientific inquiry for every choice. However, problems arise when we apply these shortcuts to complex situations where they don't belong. One of the most common shortcuts is the substitution heuristic. This occurs when we are faced with a difficult or complex question, and instead of answering it, our System 1 automatically substitutes it with an easier one. We then answer the easy question and believe we have answered the hard one. For example, imagine you are a voter trying to decide on a candidate for the local sheriff's office. The hard question you should be asking is, how successful will this person be in managing the department, enforcing the law, and maintaining public safety? To answer this properly, you would need to research the candidate's background, their past performance in law enforcement, and their specific policy proposals. But that is a lot of work for a lazy System 2. Instead, System 1 steps in and substitutes a much easier question. Does this person look like a sheriff? You might look at the candidate's posture, their uniform, or the strength of their jawline. If they match your mental prototype of a tough lawman, you decide they will be a good sheriff. You have substituted professional competence for physical appearance. The danger here is obvious. You might reject a highly experienced and capable candidate simply because they don't look the part, or vote for an incompetent one because they have a commanding presence. Another powerful shortcut is the availability heuristic. This is the tendency to estimate the frequency or probability of an event based on how easily examples of it come to mind. If you can easily recall an instance of something happening, you assume it must be quite common. This heuristic is heavily influenced by the media and our own emotions. Consider a study that asked people which was a more likely cause of death, a stroke or an accident. Statistically, strokes cause far more deaths than accidents do. However, 80% of the respondents in the study believed that accidental death was more likely. Why the discrepancy? Accidental deaths are vivid, dramatic, and frequently reported in the news. They make a strong, lasting impression on our minds. When we try to think of causes of death, the memory of a horrific car crash or a plane accident is much more available than the memory of someone quietly passing away from a stroke. Because the accident is easier to remember, System 1 incorrectly concludes that it is more frequent. The availability heuristic explains why people become terrified of shark attacks after watching a movie like Jaws **, even though the actual risk is infinitesimal. It explains why we worry about domestic terrorism more than we worry about heart disease, despite the latter being a vastly greater threat to our lives. We react to the vividness of the information rather than the probability of the event. Heuristics are the brain's way of satisficing, finding a solution that is good enough for the moment. But in a modern world filled with complex data and subtle risks, good enough can lead to disastrous mistakes. We must learn to recognize when we are using a mental shortcut. When you find yourself making a quick judgment about a person's potential or the likelihood of a disaster, ask yourself, am I answering the right question, or am I just answering the easiest one? Am I looking at the real data or just the most recent headline? By forcing System 2 to check the work of System 1, we can navigate the world with much greater precision. Human beings are natural storytellers, but we are notoriously poor statisticians. Our brains are designed to find patterns, causes, and narratives, which makes the dry, abstract world of probability and base rates feel alien to us. This leads to a phenomenon known as base rate neglect, where we ignore the underlying statistical reality of a situation in favor of more specific, but often irrelevant, information. To understand the base rate, think of it as the starting point for any prediction. Imagine a city where a large taxi company operates. In this city, 80% of the cabs are red and 20% are yellow. If you were to close your eyes and guess the color of the next cab that drives by, the most rational guess would be red. The base rate for red cabs is 80%, giving you an 80% chance of being right. However, our minds are easily distracted from this logical foundation. Imagine you are standing on a street corner and you see 5 red cabs pass by in a row. System 1, always looking for a pattern, might start to whisper, "We've seen so many red ones. The next one has asterisk to be yellow. It's due." This is a classic error. The probability of the next cab being red is still 80%, regardless of what came before it. But we focus on what we expect to see, a change in the pattern, rather than what is statistically most likely. We ignore the base rate because the story of the 5 red cabs is more compelling than the numbers. This struggle with numbers extends to our understanding of regression to the mean. This is the statistical reality that in any series of events where luck or random fluctuation plays a role, an extreme performance is likely to be followed by a more average one. Everything eventually tilts back toward the average or the mean. Consider a professional football striker who typically scores about 5 goals a month. Suddenly, in the month of September, she has an incredible run and scores 10 goals. Her coach and the fans are ecstatic, praising her hot streak and expecting her to maintain this new level of performance. However, in October and November, she goes back to scoring her usual 5 goals a month. The coach might become frustrated, criticizing the player for losing her edge or becoming lazy. But the player hasn't necessarily done anything wrong. Her 10-goal month was an outlier, a moment where skill and luck aligned perfectly. Her return to 5 goals is simply a regression to the mean. She isn't performing poorly, she is just performing at her actual average. We see this everywhere. The sophomore slump in music or sports, the curse of appearing on the cover of a magazine, or the tendency for a very successful business quarter to be followed by a mediocre one. Because we don't understand regression to the mean, we create elaborate stories to explain these fluctuations. We blame the athlete's ego, the musician's new lifestyle, or the CEO's lack of focus. In reality, it is often just the math of the universe evening things out. Our no-head for numbers means that we are constantly surprised by things that are statistically predictable. We see streaks where there is only randomness, and we ignore the base rates that should guide our expectations. To make better predictions and fairer judgments, We have to train ourselves to look past the immediate, vivid story and ask, what is the average here? What is the baseline? By embracing the boring reality of statistics, we can avoid the emotional roller coaster of expecting the impossible and being disappointed by the inevitable. We tend to think of our memory as a video camera that records our lives exactly as they happen. We believe that if we want to know how we felt during an experience, we can just play back the tape. But cognitive science reveals a much more complicated reality. We actually possess two different selves that process and remember our experiences in very different ways: the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self is the one living in the moment. It is the part of you that feels the warmth of the sun on your skin, the frustration of a traffic jam, or the joy of a good meal. It asks, how does it feel right now? This self is the most accurate witness to our lives because it records our feelings in real time. The remembering self, however, is the one that looks back after the event is over. It asks, how was it on the whole? This is the self that keeps score and tells the story of our lives. Surprisingly, the remembering self is the one that dominates our decision-making and our overall sense of well-being. The problem is that the remembering self is a very unreliable narrator. It doesn't care about the total amount of pleasure or pain we experienced. Instead, it is governed by two specific rules: duration neglect and the peak-end rule. Duration neglect means that our memories completely ignore how long an experience lasted. A 2-week vacation that was pleasant throughout is remembered no more fondly than a 1-week vacation that was equally pleasant. The time spent in the experience doesn't seem to register in the final tally of our memory. The peak-end rule is even more significant. It states that our memory of an event is determined almost entirely by 2 points: the most intense moment, the peak, and the very end of the experience. A powerful and somewhat unsettling illustration of this can be found in a study involving patients undergoing painful colonoscopies. This was back when the procedure was done without modern sedation. The patients were divided into 2 groups. Group A had a standard, relatively short but painful procedure. Group B had a much longer procedure. It started with the same level of pain as Group A, but at the very end, the doctor left the instrument in for an extra minute without moving it. This extra minute was still uncomfortable, but much less painful than the rest of the procedure. If you ask the experiencing self, Group B had a much worse time because they endured more total minutes of pain. However, when the patients were asked later to rate their overall experience, Group B remembered the procedure as being less painful than Group A. Why? Because for Group B, the end of the experience was less intense. Their remembering self focused on the peak pain and the end pain and averaged them out, ignoring the fact that the total duration of suffering was longer. This explains many of the quirks of human behavior. We might stay in a bad relationship for years because of a few peak moments of passion. We might judge a whole theater performance as terrible because the final 5 minutes were disappointing, even if the first 2 hours were brilliant. We are, in essence, making choices for a self that doesn't actually live the experiences. We plan our future vacations and life events based on what will make a good story for our remembering self, often at the expense of our experiencing self's actual day-to-day happiness. Understanding the conflict between these two selves is crucial for living a more balanced life. It reminds us to cherish the now and to be wary of the stories we tell ourselves about the then. Our memories are not records. They are edited highlights, and we must be careful not to let the editor run the whole show. The amount of effort your brain is currently exerting has a profound impact on what you believe, how you feel, and how you act. Psychologists distinguish between 2 mental states: cognitive ease and cognitive strain. Understanding the difference between them is like finding the secret settings menu for the human mind. Cognitive ease is the state you are in when things are going smoothly. There are no threats, no major challenges, and no need to mobilize intense focus. In this state, System 1 is in the driver's seat. You feel relaxed, creative, and comfortable. Because everything feels easy, you are more likely to trust your intuitions and accept information at face value. However, this ease also makes you more prone to making logical errors and falling for biases. When the mind is at ease, it is less vigilant. Cognitive strain, on the other hand, occurs when you are faced with a difficult task, a confusing piece of information, or a physical challenge. In this state, the brain recognizes that it needs more power, so it mobilizes System 2. You become more alert, more analytical, and more skeptical. You are less likely to make lazy mistakes, but you also feel more stressed and are less capable of creative, out-of-the-box thinking. Crucially, you can intentionally manipulate these states to influence how people perceive information. If you want a message to be persuasive, you should aim for maximum cognitive ease. One of the most effective ways to do this is through repetition. When we are exposed to a message over and over again, it becomes familiar. Our brains have evolved to associate familiarity with safety. If we've seen it before and it didn't kill us, it must be okay. This is why advertising and political slogans are so repetitive. The more you hear something, the more easy it feels to process, and the more likely your system one is to accept it as true, even if it is completely false. Even the physical presentation of information matters. Studies have shown that people are more likely to believe a statement if it is printed in a clear, high-contrast font than if it is printed in a blurry or difficult-to-read one. A clear font promotes cognitive ease. A blurry font creates cognitive strain. Interestingly, cognitive strain can actually be a good thing if you want someone to think more deeply. In one experiment, students were given a set of logic problems like the bat and ball problem. Half the students received the problems in a clear, easy-to-read font, while the other half received them in a tiny, washed-out, difficult font. The results were counterintuitive. The students who had the asterisk hard-to-read font performed significantly better on the test. Because the font was difficult, it created a sense of cognitive strain. This perked up their brains and forced their System 2 to engage. Because they had to work harder just to read the words, they were less likely to fall for the easy, intuitive traps set by System 1. This teaches us a vital lesson about our own thinking. If we want to be more creative and intuitive, we should seek out environments that promote ease, good moods, familiar surroundings, and clear communication. But if we need to solve a complex problem or avoid a bias, we should intentionally introduce a bit of strain. We can do this by slowing down, double-checking our work, or even rewriting a problem in a more challenging way. By adjusting the focus of our minds, we can choose whether to be the intuitive artist or the skeptical scientist. We like to think that we are objective judges of risk and value. We believe that if we are presented with the same set of facts, we will come to the same conclusion regardless of how those facts are presented. But the reality is that our judgments are incredibly fragile and are heavily influenced by framing, the way a problem or a choice is expressed to us. A powerful example of the framing effect can be seen in how we assess risk. Even when the underlying statistical probabilities are identical, a slight change in wording can lead us to completely different decisions. This is often seen in the difference between relative frequency and statistical probability. Consider the Mr. Jones experiment. Two groups of psychiatric professionals were asked to decide if it was safe to discharge a patient named Mr. Jones from a mental hospital. Group 1 was told, patients like Mr. Jones have a 10% probability of committing an act of violence. Group 2 was told, of every 100 patients similar to Mr. Jones, 10 are estimated to commit an act of violence. Statistically, these two statements are identical. However, the second group, the one given the 10 out of 100 frame, was nearly twice as likely to deny the discharge. Why? Because the second frame creates a vivid mental image. When you hear 10%, your System 2 processes an abstract number. But when you hear 10 out of 100 people, your System 1 starts to picture 10 actual violent individuals. The vividness of the image makes the risk feel much more real and frightening. This is also related to denominator neglect. This is our tendency to focus on the numerator, the number of times an event happens, and ignore the denominator, the total number of opportunities for it to happen. We react to the vividness of the event rather than its actual likelihood. Imagine a drug that protects children from a certain disease but has a small risk of a side effect. Compare these two ways of describing the risk. 1. This drug has a 0.001% chance of causing permanent disfigurement. 2. 1 out of every 100,000 children who take this drug will be permanently disfigured. Again, the math is the same. But the second statement is far more likely to scare parents. One child is a person you can imagine. You can picture their face, their suffering, and the grief of their parents. 0.001% is just a tiny abstract dot on a page. Because System 1 is driven by emotions and images, it is far more influenced by the one child than by the actual low probability. Framing is a tool used by everyone from doctors and marketers to politicians and insurance salesmen. By highlighting the gains or the losses, or by using frequencies instead of probabilities, they can nudge our System 1 in a specific direction. To protect ourselves from the framing trap, we must learn to reframe problems for ourselves. When you are presented with a choice, try to state it in the opposite way. If someone tells you a surgery has a 90% success rate, remind yourself that it also has a 10% failure rate. If a statistic is given in frequencies, convert it to a percentage. By forcing ourselves to look at the same facts through multiple frames, we can engage our System 2 and make choices based on the reality of the situation, rather than the spin of the presentation. For decades, the field of economics was dominated by a specific vision of humanity. Scholars, particularly those associated with the influential Chicago School of Economics and thinkers like Milton Friedman, argued that human beings are econs. An econ is a perfectly rational agent who always makes decisions that maximize their utility, a fancy word for their own best interest. According to utility theory, an econ looks at the facts, weighs the costs and benefits, and chooses the option with the highest objective value. For example, if you prefer oranges to kiwis, utility theory assumes you would always choose a 10% chance of winning an orange over a 10% chance of winning a kiwi. It seems perfectly logical. Econs are also supposed to value their wealth in a purely rational way. If two people have $5 million, they should be equally happy because $5 million buys the same amount of utility for both. But real humans are not econs. We are humans, and our behavior is far more complex and seemingly irrational than utility theory can explain. To see why, let's revisit the two people with $5 million, John and Jenny. According to an economist, John and Jenny are in the same position. But let's look at their day at the casino. John walked into the casino with only $1 million. After a day of gambling, he walked out with $5 million. He has quintupled his money. He is likely feeling on top of the world. Jenny, on the other hand, walked into the casino with $9 million. After a day of bad luck, she walked out with $5 million. She has lost nearly half of her fortune. Is she as happy as John? Of course not. She is likely devastated. Even though they have the exact same amount of money at the end of the day, their utility is completely different. This is because humans don't value things in a vacuum. We value them based on a reference point, where we started. For John, the reference point was $1 million, so $5 million feels like a massive gain. For Jenny, the reference point was $9 million, so $5 million feels like a crushing loss. This simple observation, that our starting point matters, was a revolutionary challenge to traditional economics. It showed that we aren't just calculating the final outcome, we are reacting to the asterisk change from our current state. Furthermore, econs are supposed to be consistent. If they are willing to take a risk in one scenario, they should be willing to take it in another if the math is the same. But as we will see in the study of prospect theory, humans are notoriously inconsistent. We are loss-averse, meaning that the pain of losing something is much greater than the joy of gaining the exact same thing. The myth of the econ is a convenient model for building mathematical equations, but it fails to capture the reality of the human experience. We are creatures of emotion, history, and perspective. We don't just want more, we want to avoid less, and we want to feel like we are moving forward from where we are. By acknowledging that we aren't robots, we can begin to build a more realistic understanding of how markets, societies, and individuals actually function. If we aren't the rational econs of traditional economics, then how do we make decisions? To answer this, we turn to prospect theory, a framework developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Prospect theory explains the irrational ways we evaluate gains and losses, and it centers on one fundamental human trait: loss aversion. Loss aversion is the psychological reality that we fear losses roughly twice as much as we value equivalent gains. Losing $100 feels much more painful than winning $100 feels good. This deep-seated fear of losing what we have drives much of our behavior, often leading us to make choices that a purely rational observer would find baffling. Consider these two scenarios. Scenario 1. You are given $1,000. You must then choose between a guaranteed extra $500 or a 50% chance to win another $1,000 and a 50% chance to win nothing. Scenario 2. You are given $2,000. You must then choose between a guaranteed loss of $500 or a 50% chance to lose $1,000 and a 50% chance to lose nothing. If you do the math, the final outcomes in both scenarios are identical. You are choosing between a certain $1,500 or a 50-50 gamble between $1,000 and $2,000. A rational econ would make the same choice in both cases, but humans don't. In the first scenario, most people are risk-averse and take the sure $500. We want to lock in the gain. In the second scenario, however, most people become risk-seeking and take the gamble. We are so desperate to avoid the sure loss of $500 that we are willing to risk losing $1,000 just for the chance of losing nothing at all. Prospect theory explains this through two key principles. The first is reference points, which we discussed with John and Jenny. In the first scenario, your reference point is $1,000, so $1,500 feels like a gain. In the second, your reference point is $2,000, so $1,500 feels like a loss. Our brains are hardwired to fight against any move that feels like a step backward from our current reference point. The second principle is diminishing sensitivity. This means that the more you have of something, the less each additional unit matters. This applies to losses as well. The jump from $0 to a $100 loss feels terrible. But the jump from $1,000 to $1,100 loss feels slightly less painful, even though the amount is the same. In our gamble, the difference between losing $500 and losing $1,000 doesn't feel as big as the difference between losing $0 and $500. This is why we take the gamble. The extra loss feels cheaper than the initial one. Loss aversion explains why investors hold onto losing stocks for too long hoping to break even, and sell winning stocks too early to lock in a gain. It explains why we struggle to declutter our homes. The loss of an old t-shirt feels more significant than the gain of a clean closet. Our gut feelings about value are not based on objective math, but on a prehistoric survival instinct to protect what is ours. By recognizing that our fear of loss is often out of proportion to the actual risk, we can start to make more balanced decisions. We can learn to ask, if I didn't already own this, how much would I pay for it? Or, am I taking this risk because I want to win or just because I'm afraid to lose? The human mind is a machine for creating cognitive coherence. We hate ambiguity and randomness, so we constantly build complete, simplified mental pictures to explain the world around us. We take a few scattered facts and weave them into a story that makes sense. Once we have this story, we become massively overconfident in its accuracy, often ignoring any data that suggests our picture might be wrong. Think about our mental image of summer. For many of us, the image is one of constant sunshine, heat, and beach days. This is our prototype for the season. Because we have this strong, coherent image, it heavily influences our decisions. If you are planning a trip in July, your mental image of summer equals sun might lead you to pack only shorts and sandals, even if you are going to a place where it frequently rains in the summer. Even if you check the weather forecast and it says cool and rainy, your mental image might still overrule the data. You think, but it's summer, it can't be that cold. You go out in your t-shirt and you end up shivering. You have allowed your simplified mental picture to override the actual evidence. We do this in much more serious areas of life, too. Business leaders often become overconfident in their vision for a new project, ignoring market research that suggests it will fail. Investors become overconfident in their picture of a company's future, ignoring the risks. We believe we understand the past, so we think we can predict the future. But our understanding of the past is itself a simplified story that ignores all the random events and luck that actually shaped history. So, how do we combat this natural overconfidence? One powerful tool is reference class forecasting. Instead of relying on your general mental image or your gut feeling about a specific project, you look for a reference class of similar cases from the past. If you are planning a home renovation, don't just ask yourself how long you think it will take. You will be overconfident and say 3 months. Instead, look at the reference class. How long do renovations of this size usually take in your city? The answer might be 6 months. By looking at the historical data of others, you get a much more realistic forecast than by looking at your own unique plan. Another strategy is to develop a long-term risk policy. This means deciding in advance how you will handle certain types of risks, rather than making a decision in the heat of the moment when your emotions and mental images are strongest. For the weather example, a risk policy might be: whenever I travel, I always bring one warm layer, regardless of the season. This simple rule protects you from your own overconfident mental image of summer. In business, a risk policy might involve setting a stop-loss limit on an investment or requiring an outside pre-mortem analysis to find potential flaws in a plan before it starts. We will never completely stop our brains from building simplified pictures of the world. It's how we survive. But we can learn to be humbly skeptical of our own certainty. By using data, looking at history, and planning for the possibility that we are wrong, we can turn our false images into a more accurate map of reality. As we conclude this exploration into the dual machinery of the human mind, we are left with a more complex and perhaps more humbling view of ourselves. We have seen that we are not the purely rational masters of our fate that we often imagine. Instead, we are the product of a constant, silent negotiation between the lightning-fast intuitions of System 1 and the slow, often reluctant deliberations of System 2. The key insights we have uncovered, from the power of priming and the traps of heuristics to the profound impact of loss aversion and the illusions of memory, all point to a single truth. Our automatic way of thinking is designed for speed and coherence, not necessarily for accuracy or long-term well-being. We are hardwired to take the path of least effort, to favor the vivid story over the dry statistic, and to protect what we have at almost any cost. However, this knowledge is not meant to discourage us. On the contrary, understanding our biases is the first step toward overcoming them. By recognizing the signs of mental laziness, we can intentionally mobilize our System 2 when it matters most. We can learn to reframe the risks we face, to look for the base rates in our predictions, and to be skeptical of the halos we place on others. The practical takeaways are clear. 1. Slow down. When faced with a complex decision, recognize that your first impulse is a suggestion from System 1, not a final verdict. Give System 2 the time it needs to check the work. 2. Seek the outside view. Use reference class forecasting. Don't ask, how will I do? Ask, how do people in this situation usually do? 3. Beware of vividness. Remember that the most memorable or emotional information is not always the most important. Look for the data behind the headlines. Ultimately, this knowledge matters because it allows us to live more intentional lives. We may never be the Econs of economic theory, but we can become more mindful humans. By acknowledging the limitations of our two minds, we can begin to navigate the world with a bit more wisdom. a bit more caution, and a much deeper understanding of the hidden forces that make us who we are. For more book summaries for free, install Zyroverse.